The healthcare discovery that saved the lives of millions of children. Remembrance of My Afternoon in Paris with vaccine titan Jonas Salk by Donald H. Marks, Maryland PhD, Emeritus Fellow, American College of Physicians. Dr. Jonas Salk was a revered physician and researcher whose team discovered a vaccine to prevent the terrible disease of paralytic polio. To many at the time, he was almost a god, a savior from the horror of polio. There is much to be learned from Dr. Salk's life, his lasting effect on the terrible disease of polio, bioethics, and the impact of preventable childhood diseases on society. Following is my experience with Salk the person, about polio vaccine, about the subtle influences that affect our life's direction, and finally the role of vaccines in children's health. Polio is a disease of the nervous system caused by a virus, a non-living but very complex biochemical. Polio is often experienced as a flu-like intestinal illness. Symptoms can range from nausea, fever, diarrhea, and can progress to damage the nerves which cause muscles to contract, leading to its most feared component, paralysis. First recorded in 1835, polio outbreaks grew steadily more prevalent. Public health a century ago was in its infancy, and it took a long time to realize that the virus was transmitted by fecal matter and secretions of the nose and throat. Poliovirus enters the victim orally, establishes itself in the intestines, and then travels to the brain or spinal cord. I suspect that many of you have never seen a case of polio, and for those physicians in the group, you may expect to go your whole career without ever treated one case. There are many people you may have heard of who had polio, lived, but continued to suffer from polio. President Franklin D. Roosevelt Itzhak Perlman, one of the world's finest violinists, was permanently disabled at age 4 and still plays sitting down. Actors Donald Sutherland, Alan Alda, Lionel Barrymore, writers Arthur C. Clarke, Robert Anton Wilson, actress Mia Farrow, singer-musicians Neil Young, David Sanborn, Dinah Shore, Joni Mitchell, Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas. Director Francis Ford Coppola, nuclear physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer. Every year in the United States, there are still a handful of breakthrough polio cases from vaccine failure, always from the live vaccine. Polio has been successfully eradicated from most countries in the world and is only left in a few, such as Pakistan, where vaccination efforts have been hindered. During the 1914 and 1919 polio epidemics in the US, large numbers of individuals came down with the disease and thousands died. The public, parents, teachers and healthcare workers panicked. Physicians and nurses made house-to-house searches to identify all infected persons. Children suspected of being infected were taken to hospitals, and the child's family was quarantined until they were no longer potentially infectious. Sometimes parents under home quarantine could not even go to their child's funeral if the child died in the hospital. Jonas Salk was born into a time of polio plague in New York City on October 28, 1914. His parents, Daniel and Dora Salk, were Ashkenazi Jews from Russian Jewish immigrant families and had not received extensive formal education. Salk grew up in the Jewish immigrant culture of New York. When he was 13, Jonas Salk entered Townsend Harris High School, a public school for intellectually gifted students. During that time, Ivy League schools restricted enrollment of Jews and blacks, which he did not consider at the time, and as an adult seemed to have little influence on his success. As a child, Salk later said, "I was not interested in science. I was merely interested in things human, the human side of nature, if you like, and I continue to be interested in that." Salk enrolled in City College at the age of 15, from which he earned a Bachelor of Science degree in 1934. For working-class immigrant families, City College represented the apex of public higher education. Getting in was tough, but tuition was free. Competition was intense, but the rules were fairly applied. No one got an advantage based on an accident of birth. After college, Jonas applied to and was accepted at NYU School of Medicine. NYU based its, at that time, modest reputation on famous alumni such as Walter Reed, who helped conquer yellow fever, another devastating disease caused by a virus. Tuition was comparatively low. Better still, NYU did not discriminate against Jews and blacks, while most of the surrounding medical schools, Cornell, Columbia, University of Pennsylvania, and Yale, had rigid quotas in place against Jews and blacks. It's hard for us today to grasp what inhibiting psychological effect quotas had on young Jews and blacks who considered applying to college and professional schools. During his years at NYU, Salk stood out from his peers because he had decided he did not want to practice medicine, instead becoming absorbed in research. My intention was to go to medical school and then become a medical scientist, Salk later reflected. I did not intend to practice medicine, although in medical school and in my internship I did all the things that were necessary to qualify me in that regard. I had opportunities along the way to drop the idea of medicine and go into science, Salk said. At one point at the end of my first year of medical school, Salk continued, I received an opportunity to spend a year in research and teaching in biochemistry, which I did. And at the end of that year I was told that I could, if I wished, switch and get a PhD in biochemistry, but my preference was to stay with medicine. And I believe that this is all linked to my original ambition or desire, which was to be of some help to humankind, so to speak, in a larger sense than just on a one-to-one basis. I think many of us have faced the decision of helping on a one-on-one basis, or to a larger cause in general, helping someone we know make a car payment or giving to United Way, helping a neighbour out of work to buy food for their children or set up an auto deduction for Feed the Children, pay for a stranger's dental bills or send a cheque to a political campaign, direct and personal or indirect, and to benefit a group or cause, difficult decisions. Salk later focused more of his studies on bacteriology, which had replaced medicine as his primary interest. The day after his graduation from medical school, Salk married Donna Lindsay, a master's candidate at the New York College of Social Work. Donna's father, Elmer Lindsay, a wealthy Manhattan dentist, viewed Salk as a social inferior, several cuts below Donna's former suitors. Eventually, her father agreed to the marriage on two conditions. First, Salk must wait until he could be listed as an official MD on the wedding invitations, and second, he must improve his rather pedestrian status by giving himself a middle name. I think that the attitude of all of the Lindsay family cursed the Salk marriage from the start, although the decay took years to become lethal. How many of our own relationships are tainted in a subtle but insidious manner, the stain only expressing itself years later? We act surprised, but if we look deeper, we can see the causality to the final outcome. Salk's marriage produced 3 sons, Peter, Darrell, and Jonathan Salk, but ended years later in divorce. After graduating from medical school, Salk began his residency at New York's Mount Sinai Hospital, where he worked in the laboratory of Dr. Francis and quickly made his mark. The fight against polio really began in 1938 when the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis, a more formal name for polio, was born. Basil O'Connor, the former law partner of President Franklin D. Roosevelt, the US's most famous polio victim, headed that foundation. That same year, the first March of Dimes fundraising program was set up, with radio networks offering free 30-second slots for promotion. Listeners were asked to send in a dime, and the White House received 2,680,000 letters within days. At the end of his medical residency, Salk began applying for permanent research positions. But he discovered that many of the jobs he desired were closed to him due to quotas on Jews, which prevailed at that time in so much of the medical research establishment. I've had dreams and I've had nightmares, Salk said, but I have conquered my nightmares because of my dreams. Paralytic poliomyelitis was, if not the most serious, easily the most frightening public health problem of the post-World War II era. The epidemics kept getting worse, and its victims were usually children. In the 20 states that reported the disease back in 1916, there were 27,363 cases. New York alone had 9,023 cases, of which 2,448, or 28%, resulted in death, and a larger number in paralysis. However, polio did not gain national attention until 1921, when Franklin D. Roosevelt, former vice presidential candidate and soon to be governor of New York, came down with paralytic polio. At the age of 39, Roosevelt was left with severe paralysis and spent most of his presidency in a wheelchair. As more states began recording instances of polio, the numbers of victims grew larger. Nearly 58,000 cases of polio were reported in 1952, with 3,145 people dying and 21,269 left with mild to disabling paralysis. In some parts of the country, concern assumed almost the dimensions of panic. Parents kept children home from school, avoided parks and swimming pools, and played only in small groups with the closest of friends. Cases usually increased during the summer when children were home from school. The public reaction was as to a plague, and scientists were in a frantic race to find a cure. As the fear of polio increased each year, funds to combat it increased from $1.8 million to $67 million by 1955. Research continued during those years, but it turns out that everything scientists believed about polio at first was wrong, leading them down many blind alleys. Furthermore, most researchers were experimenting with highly dangerous live vaccines. In one test, 6 children were killed and 3 left crippled. I pictured myself as a virus or a cancer cell, Salk said, and sensed what it would be like. After successful tests on laboratory animals, an experimental vaccine had to be tested on human beings. In November 1953, at a conference in New York's Waldorf Astoria Hotel, Salk said, "I will be personally responsible for the vaccine." He announced that his wife and 3 sons had been among the first volunteers to be inoculated with his vaccine. As a result of his preliminary results in 1954, when polio was destroying more American children than any other communicable disease, Salk's vaccine was ready for field testing. There is hope in dreams, imagination, and in the courage of those who wish to make those dreams a reality, Salk said. With the hopes of the world upon him, Salk worked 16 hours a day, 7 days a week for years. It had been, Salk later described, 2.5 years of drudgery and hard work. Salk said, "The reward for work well done is the opportunity to do more." I am sure he believed that, but one can only speculate on what effect this level of work had on his personal life. His first marriage ended in divorce in 1968. The field trial set up to test the Salk vaccine was the most elaborate program of its kind in history, involving 20,000 physicians and public health officers, 64,000 school personnel, and 220,000 volunteers. Over 1,800,000 school children took part in the trial. When you inoculate children with a polio vaccine, you don't sleep well for 2 or 3 months, Salk said. On April 12, 1955, Dr. Francis declared the vaccine to be safe and effective. The announcement was made exactly 10 years to the day after the death of President Roosevelt. Church bells rang across the country, factories observed moments of silence, synagogues and churches held prayer meetings, and parents and teachers wept. Salk was hailed as a miracle worker, and the day almost became a national holiday. His sole focus had been to develop a safe and effective vaccine as rapidly as possible, with no interest in personal profit. When questioned on the safety of the polio vaccine he developed, Salk said, "It is safe, and you can't get safer than safe." Still, he also commented in reflection, "It is said, to await certainty is to await eternity." As you may know, there are 2 basic types of polio vaccine. There is a live attenuated vaccine taken orally, the OPV Salk vaccine. The inactivated Sabin vaccine, which is given by injection IPV, is also available. Every year there are a handful of polio cases from live attenuated polio vaccine. There is still some discussion in the vaccine community about whether it is safer and more effective to give OPV or IPV. Salk preferred not to have his career as a scientist affected by too much personal attention, as he had always tried to remain independent and private in his research and in his life. But this proved to be impossible. Airplane pilots would announce that he was on board, and passengers would burst into applause. Hotels routinely would upgrade him into their penthouse suites. A meal at a restaurant inevitably meant an interruption from an admirer, and scientists approached him with drop-jawed wonder, as though some of the stardust might rub off. For the most part, Salk was appalled at the demands as the public figure he had become, and resentful of what he considered to be the invasion of his privacy. The New York Times, a few months after his vaccine announcement, wrote that at 40, the once obscure scientist was lifted from his laboratory almost to the level of a folk hero. He received a presidential citation, a score of awards, 4 honorary degrees, half a dozen foreign decorations and letters from thousands of fellow citizens. Salk himself said, "The worst tragedy that could have befallen me was my success. I knew right away that I was through, cast out." If Salk the scientist sounds austere, wrote the New York Times, Salk the man is a person of great warmth and tremendous enthusiasm. People who meet him generally like him. This is how I knew Jonas Salk. An award-winning geneticist called him a Renaissance scientist. Brilliant, sophisticated, driven, a fantastic creature. I completely agree. Salk had very little perceptible interest in the things that interest most people, such as making money. That is how I found Dr. Salk in 1992. I spent 3 wonderful hours one-on-one with Dr. Salk at a vaccine conference in Paris. As we talked, he was relaxed, responsive, pleasant, and not at all put off. I remember that only part of our discussion related to vaccines. I asked him about the practice of medicine, research as a medical career, and how he viewed the future of vaccines. I too had taken a mostly research path in medicine and enjoyed vaccine research. We talked about his experiences as a Jew, as a Jewish doctor, and the public perception and expectations of Jewish doctors. Growing up Jewish today is a lot different from growing up Jewish in the 50s and 60s with their restricted country clubs, colleges and bathrooms, and all the subtle discrimination. How then are we doing almost 60 years into the availability of polio vaccine? In 2011, there were only 650 wild polio virus cases. Most were in endemic countries such as Pakistan, Afghanistan and Chad. The polio eradication through vaccination has in general worked, as has a similar approach for other lethal viruses like smallpox. Switching for a moment from Salk the biophilosopher to disease, what are the major causes of death in the USA and what meanings can we learn? Other than cardiovascular disease and cancer, the remainder of the top causes of death certainly are preventable. With respect to suicide, sadly, there is 1 suicide per day in our military. More than 3 women and 1 man are murdered by their intimate partners in this country every day. 1/3 of women murdered each year are killed by intimate partners. The health-related costs of intimate partner violence exceed $5.8 billion each year. Of that amount, nearly $4.1 billion are for direct medical and mental health care services, and nearly $1.8 billion are for the indirect costs of lost productivity or wages. Infectious diseases. Illnesses which are communicable, can be passed from person to person, and for the most part are preventable. Major infectious diseases that plague Americans include hepatitis, HIV, pneumonia, meningitis, DPT, pneumonia, urinary and staph infections. Major infectious diseases afflicting children include chickenpox and shingles, cold sores, herpes simplex, impetigo, measles, rubella, German measles, scabies, meningitis, DPT, and diarrhea. These are for the most part preventable through hygiene, medication and vaccines. Today, what are the major causes of death in children? Not surprisingly, these depend on age group. The top 3 causes of death by age group are as follows. For 0 to 1-year-olds, developmental and genetic conditions that were present at birth, sudden infant death syndrome, and all conditions associated with prematurity and low birth weight. For 1 to 4-year-olds, accidents, developmental and genetic conditions that were present at birth, and cancer. For 5 to 14-year-olds, accidents, cancer and homicide. And for 15 to 24-year-olds, accidents, homicide and suicide. Worldwide, in 2010, 7.6 million children died before reaching 5 years old. About half of these child deaths occur in Africa. Approximately 60 countries account for 94% of under 5 child deaths. Reduction of child mortality is the 4th of the United Nations Millennium Development Goals. According to UNICEF, most child deaths result from one of the following 5 causes or a combination thereof: acute respiratory infections, diarrhea, measles, malaria, war and malnutrition. For the state of Alabama, in 2007, where I lived and practiced medicine for 14 years, there were 943 deaths in children less than 18 years old, and 84 deaths per 100,000 children. The death rate was higher in the non-white population than in the white population. We see that infectious diseases are not among the leading causes of death for children in Alabama or in any state. Most causes of child death in Alabama, in the USA, and in the world are preventable, and we know how to prevent them. In fact, no research is needed. We can act now. We have programs to reduce cancer, drowning and motor vehicle accidents, but the incidence rate per year is constant for many of these problems. Our efforts would seem to not be effective. Easily 2/3 of childhood deaths worldwide are preventable. Malnutrition and the lack of safe water and sanitation contribute to half of all these children's deaths. Research and experience show that most of the children who die each year could be saved by low-tech, evidence-based, cost-effective measures such as vaccines, antibiotics, micronutrient supplementation, insecticide-treated bed nets, improved family care and breastfeeding practices, and oral rehydration therapy. In addition to providing vaccines and antibiotics to children, education could also be provided to mothers about how they can make simple changes to living conditions, such as improving hygiene, in order to increase the health of their children. Mothers who are educated will also have increased confidence in the ability to take care of their children, therefore providing a healthier relationship and environment for them. Many societal afflictions are certainly transmissible from person to person. Hate, violence, bigotry, violence, murder. Once persons are infected, these diseases pass like polio virus to infect the brain. Why not, in the tradition of Salk, create vaccines to immunize people, immunize society, immunize cultures, and immunize various ethnic and religious groups against these social diseases? We have known for a long time what components are needed to go into this vaccine: love, tolerance, education, equality, and social justice. The injection will be painless, but the vaccine's efficacy is dependent on the will of individuals, leaders, and society to react. Each of us can become in our own lives like Dr. Jonas Salk, to dedicate our lives to the prevention of death and suffering, both on an individual level and for the greater humanity, locally and throughout the world, for our brothers and our sisters everywhere. Let us use the vaccine of peace and love to make us immune to war and hate, needless suffering, poverty and injustice. This full written report with illustrations and references, and many other of my writings, are found at my blog site www.ditchmarks.blogspot.com. I welcome your comments on all these issues. Contact me on WhatsApp or Telegram.